Hello again, it's Dr. Robert Guthrie getting back to our Sunday school series that was started at Jerome United Methodist Church here in Dublin, Ohio, and we had to go to this type of remote broadcast, and we're working our way through the New Testament. We've gotten to the third part of Luke, which is chapters 13 to 18, and then we'll finish up in one more segment, finish up the Gospel of Luke. This part of Luke is a little bit difficult to present on. It's a mixture of parables and stories. It's got a fair amount of tension and some anger and frustration in it. And so in some of the stories are difficult to interpret. So I'm going to do the best I can, which is what I try to do all the time. And you all hopefully will just bear with me, because some of the things you really can't figure out all the time. And the context is good to remember. One of my colleagues asked me, if Jesus loved everybody, why didn't he love the Pharisees? Which is fairly common in these scriptures. They're the rivals, they're the enemies. The time Luke got around to putting this gospel together was probably about 80 or 85. And the temple had been destroyed in 70 AD, a decade before. And with that, the old guard of Judaism, the Sadducees and the high priests of the temple, the inherited priests, that had been wiped out by the Romans, all killed. So the Judaism that survived and evolved into modern Judaism is Judaism of the Pharisees, Pharisaic Judaism it's called. But at the time this gospel was written, the Christian movement, the Jesus movement, which became Christianity, and the Pharisaic Judaism movement were starting to separate. And each side resented the other because they thought the other side had gotten it all wrong. The Christian movement thought, God promised us a Messiah, and he sent this Messiah, and you guys aren't accepting him. And the Pharisaic people thought, well, this wasn't the Messiah we wanted. We didn't want one that preached love and magnanimity and faith. We wanted one that would lead us as a military conquest and throw the Romans out. Well, the problem with the Pharisaic approach was that really couldn't reach out to the rest of the world beyond their little community. So there was a lot of tension there, and you'll find a lot of tension at certain parts of these Gospels as they're written during this time, where these two groups began to harp at each other, crab at each other, struggle with each other for dominion over the people they were trying to convince. So it's easy to understand the tension when you understand the situation that they were having. The first story in here is that a woman who'd been crippled for 18 years, and Jesus bumps into her in the synagogue on the Sabbath. And this is one of several situations of healing on the Sabbath. And Jesus heals her, and the Pharisees are upset. You could have healed her any other day. Why'd you heal her today? Well, basically because she was here and I was here, and it was time to heal her. And who wouldn't do a mission of great mercy on the Sabbath? If your son fell down a well during the Sabbath, you'd get him out. You wouldn't leave him down there until the next day. If your animals were in distress, etc., you would take care of them. So, and it's an interesting thing, because the way I read it is that the Pharisees were worshiping the law, not the Lord. And that's an interesting challenge. We've talked about this before, that faiths that are legalistically oriented have to be careful that you don't start worshiping the law, particularly the letter of the law. You can't do this, you can't do that. Rather than the Lord. Now, I remember growing up in West Virginia in the 1950s and 60s, we had what were called the blue laws. You couldn't have retail open. The Sears was closed, and the Kmart was closed, and all that. And the food stores could be open, and the movie theaters. But my family was a very strict observer of the Sabbath. I remember, people sometimes, we didn't even cut the grass in the yard on the Sabbath. Wouldn't play golf on the Sabbath, those kinds of things. It's changed a whole lot now, so most people don't understand this degree of rigidity, but it's very much part of the personality of certain types of churches. So anyway, he just heals her, and they fuss and fume, and he basically says, you got to love, this is not loving your neighbor when you say don't heal this poor crippled woman just because it's the Sabbath. His next lessons are actually rural types of analogies, because this is up in the rural part of the Galilee. And he talks about if you have a faith that's as big as a mustard seed. A mustard seed is a tiny little seed, really tiny, and it grows into about a 20, 25-foot tree. And he's saying that's a good example of a tiny little faith that you would have would grow into this large, very beneficial structure. He used the same thing about yeast. You put a tiny little bit of yeast in as you're making the bread, and then you heat it, and the yeast causes the loaf to rise. So a tiny little bit of yeast can cause the rising of the bread, as a good analogy, but things that these people could understand. He did talk about the challenge of trying to move towards salvation, that it's easy to go for the wide and easy way in life and do what you want and surrender to your passions and your various sinful behaviors, but not achieve salvation, that the road to salvation is narrow and demanding. You have to constantly be on your guard. And I think that's all true. It's true for us now. We have to constantly be on our guard. And there's a reference in there about not making it through the narrow door that's gotten into some of our vernacular. It talks about wailing and grinding of teeth or gnashing of teeth. And that's a phrase that people have used, people like me who've grown up in the church, where you're familiar with it. We've used that to describe a situation of discomfort or discomfort on your part and suffering, the wailing and gnashing of teeth that people have. Then he heals another person on the Sabbath. This is a man with dropsy. Now, most people don't know what dropsy is. Dropsy is heart failure. And it refers to dropsy because he gets swelling around the ankles from the reaccumulation of fluid from the heart not functioning well. So Jesus heals him on the Sabbath. And, these types of healing, this one and the child with seizures that we talked about last time, that shows his power of healing. He can basically give this man normal heart function just by touching him or instructing him or whatever. Something that we can't do now. We can treat it and drag it out. Usually, and before the modern treatments, a person with dropsy, man would survive a year or two before he died. So, that's essentially touching him and giving him a new heart. And this is where he makes the point when they're critiquing him for healing on the Sabbath about, if your son fell down a well, you'd haul him out. You wouldn't worry about it. Some other good lessons in life, which are also very good, and also about not claiming to be something special, because we're all special, but we're not. And he said at a gathering, if you're invited to a fancy gathering, don't go up and sit up front in the place of honor, because if the host sees you up there and doesn't want you, then he's going to tell you to go sit in somewhere else and you'll be humiliated. Go sit in the back, which is what I do in most types of meetings anyway, trying to be inconspicuous. Go sit in the back, and then if you're due to have a person of honor, they'll come get you and bring you up there, and you'll receive the real honor. So, put yourself last. The last shall be first. Don't try to put yourself first. Don't get too full of yourself. So he has another version of the feast. We did that in Matthew a couple weeks ago, and that's when in Matthew it's a king who has a wedding feast for his son. This is just a rich person with a feast, and he sets up this magnificent feast, and he sends his servants out to bring in all his friends and colleagues who had promised him they would come to the feast, and they all have an excuse. Well, I just bought some land, I got to go check it out. I just bought a yoke of oxen, I got to go, blah, 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 blah. And they all refuse to come. And he's furious. So he sends his servants out to the streets, gather the poor, everybody you can think of, invite them to this wonderful feast we had. And they still weren't full then, so he said, well, go to the roads where the travelers are going through and invite them. This is a very important lesson, because this story, which is clearly, one of your pivotal parables, makes the point of that if the Jewish people are not going to accept the Messiah, some of them did, some of them didn't, if they're not all going to accept the Messiah, the point of this Messiah was to be the Messiah for everyone, for the whole world, not only for the people in that part of Western Asia, but the people in Europe, people in Africa, people in Asia, and even in the New World when the Europeans got to the New World. So it was, the Messiah was for everyone, and if the other people don't accept it, so be it. We're just going to go on with that. And then he's got a question about his family. He is not close to his family. Actually, one of his brothers becomes the leader of the early church after the resurrection. James, who was known as the brother of the Lord. But in this situation, he wasn't one of the regular followers. And he says, my family are my followers, and you have to be able to renounce your family to follow Jesus. And there's a phrase in there that says you must hate your family. And that doesn't really mean hate in the modern sense of this hostility and antipathy. It really means you have to have a detachment from your family. Now, the modern American family is very different than the first century Palestinian family. The first century Palestinian family, you saw this custom go through for centuries, where the parental power remained over the children and grandchildren as long as the parents were around. So you clearly couldn't cross your father about certain things, or your mother. These people could tell you, what kind of work you're going to go into, where did you live, you joined the family business, et cetera, et cetera. So the family unit was much, much tighter. Jesus was very different because his mission was to the world, not just to the family. So the family often didn't understand him. So that's what he means, not hate, despise, or anything like that. He means be able to detach yourself from the control of your parents and to follow him. Because in many parts of the world, marriages are still arranged. I've known people that have had arranged marriages from India and Asia and stuff like that. So that goes on, but it's not part of the United States. My three brothers scattered all over the country. One brother in Atlanta, one in Pennsylvania. I ended up in Ohio. So the family is not nearly as tight, but the old family was very, very tight. And then he goes on to 3 lessons of God's mercy. One is if the person who has 100 sheep and one of the sheep gets lost, and he puts the 99 aside to go find the lost sheep. And when he finds the lost sheep, he's thrilled, and he tells all his friends he's excited because this lost sheep had been lost and is now found and back with the herd. This is the lady who loses a drachma. Drachma is a Greek name for a penny. They still use that term in Greece now. And if you have 100 and you lose one, you sweep the house and look all over it and celebrate finding the lost one. So the point of these 2 lessons is that we should be happy if sinners come to the Lord, even late in their life, rather than resenting them, having done that debauchery and then realizing the error of their ways and then coming in and joining us. We should be thrilled, not resentful. Humans are often very human. We can be very resentful things. And then they go into the great story of this, which is the prodigal son. For those like me who were the good child and didn't go off and do this, I understand this story quite a bit. And this, of course, we're very familiar with. It's one of the great stories Jesus ever told. This is the wealthy family. Father has 2 sons. The younger son is restless, and he says to the father, "Give me my share of the inheritance, and I'm going to take it and go make my own way in the world." Didn't quite say it that way, but he takes it and he squanders it in a faraway land in riotous living. And it's implied with prostitutes, etc., which is probably what would happen. And then he wastes it all, and it's all gone. And then a famine hits, because you had famine in those parts of the world regularly, and he's forced to hire himself out as a herder of the pigs in that faraway land. And for a Hebrew person, to be having to take care of these unclean animals, that's the lowest of the low. And he's feeling down, and he thinks, the pigs have something to eat and I don't. If I try to eat their food, people will get mad at me. Even my father's hired men are treated better than this. So I'm going to go home and beg forgiveness and tell him I'm no longer need to be your son. Can I just be one of your hired men? And the father sees him coming up and he's thrilled, and runs out to him, embraces him, has the servants bring him good clothes, puts a ring on his finger, tells the servants to have a party, have a festival, and we're going to kill the fatted calf, which is the term my family used to use when they're having food celebrations. We're going to have a bunch of people over and have a big feast. We'd kill the fatted calf. It's interesting how some of these analogies get into your speech if you live with the Bible like I did. And so they're having this party, and the good son, who's about working all day, comes back, and he's hearing the celebration. They're having dancing and music and all this. And he said, "What's going on?" And the servant tells him, "Your brother's returned, and your father's killed the fatted calf. We're having this thing." And he starts pouting. I don't blame him. It's exactly how I would feel. And the father comes out to him, and the son, the good son, said, "You never did this for me. You didn't give me the fatted calf to have a party with my friends and this and that." And the father's point is very well taken. He said, "Your brother was lost, and now he's found. And everything I have is yours. You don't have to worry, and now your brother is lost and it's found, and we need to celebrate. So the point of that is we need to welcome the lost souls who come to the Lord and encourage them without the resentment that many people would feel about these people getting away with their life of sin and debauchery. It's an interesting and very powerful story, and I always have identified with the good son. I was the good son of the family, not the prodigal type son. And I'm not going to get into who was the prodigal son and who wasn't. There's a very complicated story next, which is about the crafty steward. And the master gets mad at the steward. He says, I haven't been managing my affairs well. And these stewards in the first century Palestine were people who were your managers of your household. You would, if you were a wealthy person, you wouldn't necessarily do this yourself. You'd have a steward who would take care of the employees, who would manage the business relationships, et cetera, and it was a position of power and respect, but complexity. It's a complicated story, and so he's going to fire this guy because he's not doing his job. So the steward goes to the various people who owe his master money, and he says, how much oil servings do you owe my master? The guy says 100. He says, well, pay me 50, and we'll call it even, and somebody else about taking less. And you read this, if you read it without understanding, you think, what is this about? And he gets rewarded because he brings all this money in, all these debts back into the master. What he was doing was eliminating his commission. So if he had collected the 100 measures of oil from one person, he would have gotten 50 and the master would have gotten 50. So he gives up his commission, as he does on these various things, to give the master what the master is owed and please the master. So that's what it is. It's not a case of rewarding dishonesty. This guy was actually cutting himself out of his own commission, and therefore is an interesting story about how he's rewarded. Then you get some very clear questions about money. Luke is the most conscientious about the perils of wealth and the perils of money, and he talks about it. Money, as tainted as it is, you need to use it to do the right things, and that's a complex question. Trust many in little things, then also do great things and good things. If they do well in little things, they'll do well in big things. If they don't do well in little things, you can't trust them on bigger things. That's a comment about human nature. People that are liars and thieves and stuff continue that way much of their life. And very specific comments about the dangers of wealth, that you can't serve two masters. You either love one and hate the other, or hate the one and love the other. You can't love God and money. And this is a huge challenge for us. There's a lot of money in our culture. Greed is the great corrupter, in my opinion. It's a great corrupter in business. It's a great corrupter in politics. It's a great corrupter among people of the church. At this time, he condemns the Pharisees for their love of money. When I read that, I thought, wow, there's a lot of famous church people who have amassed enormous amounts of money. Oral Roberts died with a fortune of about $110 million. Now, what does he need $110 million for? That's not that unusual among church people. Franklin Graham pays himself $1.2 million a year from his two charities that he runs, $600,000 from the Billy Graham Ministries and $600,000 from Samaritan's Purse. It's really staggering to see this, because you can't love money. If you're going to love money, you can't love God, and it's right there, and you got to battle it. And pastors got to be very careful, because pastors and Sunday school teachers and other people commit the same sins everybody else does. The same temptations. We have to guard ourselves against these things all the time. There's another parable about a rich man, and there was a poor man who was named Lazarus, not the Lazarus that was raised from the dead, a different Lazarus. Poor man named Lazarus would lie outside his house begging, and he had sores, and the dogs would lick the sores, and the rich man had no interest in him. And then he dies, and he's down in Hades, which is the term Luke uses, and Hades is the Greek underworld. And it's evolved into the hell, and he has them suffering and being burned down there, which I don't think the Greek underworld had, but this is kind of a combination of underworlds. And he looks up and he sees Lazarus, the poor man, having been welcomed into heaven, and he says, could he not take pity on me and touch his finger in water and touch it on my tongue? And the master says, no, you didn't show him any mercy. You don't get any mercy. It's kind of a harsh tone. And he said, well, at least send somebody to warn my brothers who are still alive not to act like this. And they know if they're not going to be understand it when you're alive, are they going to really understand it if we come to them later? So it's a difficult story to read, but it's basically trying to say you can't live your life for yourself and possessions and property and money and then expect mercy on the other side, because your God has been the money, not God. Then there's another severe admonition, which you find in all the synoptics, about leading people astray. You do find one later, which talks about curses on the people who lead children astray, which is really a poignant point, because we've had a lot of sexual abuse of children heavily with the pedophilia in the Roman Catholic Church. There's been less of it in the Protestant churches. It's mainly heterosexual male pastors and young female parishioners. But it goes on. People abuse their power to commit the sinful behavior and punish other people with it. Really, it's really a terrible thing to do that. And Jesus is very condemning of it there. There's an interesting story of he's going into the Samaritan area. Samaria was below Galilee, south of Galilee, in between Galilee and Jerusalem. Most of his ministry was in Galilee. He's heading to Jerusalem now. There's a Samaritan area on the Samaritan border where 10 men with severe skin diseases come up to him and ask for healing. He said, go to the priest and make the offering. They actually had situations where people had been healed before Jesus came along. And there's a particular ritual and sacrifice you would make. And they go, and on the way, he heals them at a distance. And only one of them comes back to him to thank him. That's an interesting thing. Out of 10, only one comes back to thank him. He says, weren't there 10 of you? And the guy says, yes. The others didn't come. So, oh, okay. They weren't any more grateful to miracles than we would be now. Then he... then he makes another point that people will come along and they'll be projecting that they can predict when the end of the world is going to come, when God's time is going to come, the kingdom of God is going to be at hand. And if you're familiar with history, this happens periodically. People will say, that 1,000, when the millennium turn, we're going to have at the end of the world. People would say, even several times in American history, people would say the world's going to end on Thursday night in 1838 or something. They go out in the mountain and wait, and the world obviously didn't end. And it kind of ruined their following. But he says that people are going to say this all the time, just ignore them. Now, the interesting thing is this is still happening. Pat Robertson of the PTL Network, back in October, which is, we're taping now in November, predicted that Donald Trump was going to win the election that was held a couple of weeks ago. That obviously isn't going to happen. And he also predicted that a large asteroid was going to destroy the Earth within a few years. And you think, wow, I wonder if that's true. That'd be, really something. Well, you go back in his history, he's predicted this twice before, not the election, but the destruction of the Earth. In 1976, he said it was going to happen by 1982. Obviously didn't happen. And again in 1990, he predicted it. Let's say it would happen by 2007. That obviously didn't happen either. So I have a problem with this type of person who takes advantage of their powerful preaching position to violate the 11th and the 12th commandments. I've always joked that Mel Brooks had it correct, that he had Moses coming down with 3 tablets and dropping one and said, whoops, I have 10 commandments, not 15. The 11th commandment, in my usage, most pastors I've shared it with have enjoyed it, is thou shalt not take thyself too seriously. This is a very important trick for people of prominence, professional talkers like myself. I'm a professional talker. Pat Robertson's a professional talker. Not to get too full of yourself, because you can really get all flattered by this. And the second one is, thou shalt not believe thine own BS, okay? You got to be very careful that you don't convince yourself of how important and self-righteous and all that you are. So sometimes these people are acting very much like the Pharisees of the ancient time. And when I looked this up, because I knew about these stories, I looked it up, and it turns out that Pat Robertson's net worth is estimated somewhere between $200 million and $1 billion. I thought, wow, that's a lot of money. What does he need all that money for? He doesn't. But again, as a prominent pastor, you got to be aware that you have pastors commit the same sins everybody else does, that you have the same weaknesses everybody else does, and you got to guard against them. And in my observation, with most people, greed is the great corrupter. In a society like ours, where there's so much money floating around, and these people are so good at raising money, so send us these donations, we're not doing this, we're doing that, et cetera, et cetera. And people, often poor people, send them money, and they're sitting on hundreds of millions of dollars of money that they really don't need. So anyway, I just thought I'd show that, share that little bit to you, which came out of what Jesus said. Jesus was unclear as to when the world is going to come to an end, and I don't really worry about that at all. It's going to happen when it happens, and I'm not going to worry about it. Then there's an interesting parallel. Like I said, these are a lot of parables that are kind of tough, of an unscrupulous judge who loves neither mankind nor God. And there's this poor woman who keeps constantly appealing to him, I need justice about this. And he says, well, finally, I'm just going to give her just because she's been such a pest. And the point of this is you keep reaching out to God, he's not going to turn against you, similar to what, he's going to answer your supplications. I don't know, you can see my cat's coming in here trying to nip at me. You can see that she's joined us again. She likes to come up here and join us at this time. Then there's a very interesting where two people go in to pray in the temple. One is a Pharisee who's dressed very richly in fine clothes, and he stands there and he's praying to God, thanking him that I'm such a great person, that I'm not like this poor, scummy tax collector over there. I'm so righteous, et cetera, et cetera. Again, taking themselves far too seriously. The tax collectors over there saying, "Oh Lord, please forgive me. I'm a sinful man. Please forgive me and guide me." Now, who's God going to listen to? The rich person who brags about how good he is, or the tax collector who's a sinful person admits it and asks for forgiveness? Of course, you're going to listen for the person that asks for forgiveness. Then Luke repeats the story of which was called the rich young ruler, and Matthew is called a rich aristocrat here. He wants to follow Jesus, and Jesus says, well, what have you done? And have you obeyed the commandments? And he said, yes, I've obeyed them all. And he says, good, well then take all your possessions and sell them all, give it to the poor, and come follow me. And the man goes away brokenhearted because he was very wealthy. It's a very challenging thing when I read it. Are we really supposed to do that? We're supposed to share our possessions with the poor, and we really try to do that. But it's very, very challenging. What he really pointed out to this person was the most important thing to him was not following Jesus, but was holding on to his wealth. So you got to be willing to put your faith ahead of your other desires of property like that. Then he makes it clear how difficult it is for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. It's a camel can pass through the eye of a needle easier than a rich man can enter the kingdom. But he does say after that God can do anything. It's really a warning against the love of money. Because if you think you can't fall into the love of money, each of us can. And you really have to struggle that to keep that under control. Because money is just possessions, it's just property, that all it is. He has a third prophecy of his passion. I had forgotten to mention the other two times, and he warns the followers, I'm heading to Jerusalem, I'm going to be, arrested and crucified and buried. And this is the third warning is in here. I should have mentioned the other two in the previous lessons. And his point that on his way to Jerusalem, that a prophet should not die outside of Jerusalem, because if he's going to be martyred, that's the place he should be martyred. And final miracle story is he goes down to Jericho, and he's entering Jericho, and there's a blind man sitting by the roadside begging, and he calls out, Jesus, Son of David, come and remember me, come and heal me. Jesus kept referring to him as the Son of David. Now, if you're not into the Christological questions, you can wonder, well, is Jesus really a son of David? He's also the Son of God. Well, he was both. Jesus is fully man and fully God, with a mystical union of the two. The fully man is traced back in the lineages in the Gospels to David. So he was of the house of David. So his human side, which came from his mother, was of the house of David. And his divine presence, of course, was divine also. So he wasn't just divine, he was both together. So he's remember that Jesus was human and divine at the same time. And this is where we stop. And at the next lesson, he'll go up into Jerusalem and suffer the fate that we know, but be raised again on the third day to allow us to believe in him and save us from our sins. This is Dr. Robert Guthrie. It's been a pleasure.